Elvis Presley's voice. It hits you, that growl, that drawl, that certain way of saying things. People talk about his music, his looks, his hips. But his language, how he spoke, how he sang, it's a whole other story. It's not just an accent. Like, it's a mix of places, people, and times. Think about it, he came from Tupelo, Mississippi, a small town. Then he moved to Memphis, Tennessee, a city buzzing with different sounds. Black and white music, country and blues, gospel and pop. All of that went into his ears, then came out his mouth. Was it truly his voice, or a blend of the South? How much of his dialect was performance, and how much was simply him? His early interviews sound raw, unpolished. Later on, his speech changed a bit, smoothed out. You hear the South in him? Sure. But which South? The poor white South. The gospel South. The urban black South. It's all there, tangled up. We can pull it apart piece by piece to see what made his language so unique, so powerful. At number 17, where did his voice truly begin? Elvis Presley's journey into language began in Tupelo, Mississippi on January 8th, 1935. This isn't just a birth date. It's the starting point of his linguistic landscape. Well, Tupelo was, and still largely is, a rural southern town. The dialect spoken there falls squarely into what linguists call Southern American English. But it's not just one thing. Within Southern speech, there are many variations. Researchers like those involved in the Linguistic Atlas of the Gulf States, or LAGS, have mapped these subtle differences for decades. They look at vowel shifts like the Southern vowel shift, where pen might sound more like pin, or how my stretches out into two distinct syllables, mai. For Elvis, growing up in Tupelo meant being immersed in a specific type of working-class Southern dialect. His early life was marked by poverty. This exposed him to a community where speech was often direct, practical, and heavily accented. He wasn't hearing formal, broadcast English. He heard the speech of cotton mill workers, farmers, and neighbors struggling to make ends meet. This foundational sound included features like the lack of a strong sound at the end of words, known as non-roticity, so car might sound more like ka. It included the use of fixin' to mean about to, or all for you all. These were not just quaint expressions. They were integral parts of his linguistic identity before he ever sang a note. Consider the work of linguist Michael Montgomery, who has studied Southern American English extensively. His research shows how specific grammatical structures and lexical items are deeply embedded in the region's history. For example, the double modal constructions like might could or used to could are common in the South. While Elvis didn't always use these publicly, the underlying structure of his early speech would have been informed by them. His family, Vernon and Gladys Presley, both spoke with strong Mississippi accents. Their language would have been his primary model. Gladys especially influenced him deeply. Her way of speaking, her turns of phrase became part of his natural repertoire. He absorbed it like a sponge. But Tupelo was also a place where different cultural streams flowed, even if gently. While segregated, there was always some overlap between black and white communities, particularly through shared religious experiences and music. Elvis attended Assembly of God churches. These churches, while predominantly white, often incorporated a passionate call and response style that had roots in African American worship traditions. This exposure, even indirect, might have subtly influenced his cadence and rhythm of speech, setting the stage for later, more direct influences. His voice didn't just appear. It was shaped by the specific dirt, the specific sounds, and the specific struggles of his earliest home. Like it was born into a very particular linguistic world. What if his childhood environment had been less rural, more urban? Would his accent have been less pronounced, or just different? How much of his early dialect was a conscious choice, even at a young age, to fit in, and how much was purely unconscious absorption? And how deeply did the unique sound of his mother's voice, rather than just her words, impact his own vocal patterns later on? Number 16, how did the move to Memphis change his speech? In 1948, Elvis and his family moved to Memphis, Tennessee. This move was a seismic shift in his linguistic development. Tupelo was a small town. Memphis was a bustling city, a melting pot of sounds. It was a major center for blues, gospel, and country music. This urban environment exposed Elvis to a far wider range of dialects and idiolects than he had ever encountered. The sociolinguistics of Memphis at that time were complex. It was a city with a significant African American population, and its culture permeated many aspects of daily life, including language and music, even in a segregated society. Linguists like William Labov have shown how urban environments act as accelerators of language change and variation. When people from different backgrounds come together, their speech patterns often blend, adapt, or even create new forms. For Elvis, Memphis meant hearing more pronounced African American vernacular English Ave in his daily life. He lived in public housing projects like Lauderdale Courts, where he interacted with both black and white children. This close proximity provided a fertile ground for linguistic cross-pollination. He heard the rhythm, the intonation, and specific lexical items of Ave firsthand. This isn't to say he adopted Ave wholesale, but rather that its elements began to mix with his existing Mississippi Southern accent. Scholars like Peter Guralnick, in his book Last Train to Memphis, detail Elvis's deep immersion in the black community's music and culture on Beale Street and in local churches. While Guralnick focuses more on musical influence, the connection between music and language is inseparable. The phrasing in blues music, the vocalizations in gospel, these all come with their own linguistic characteristics. Elvis spent hours listening to records, to radio stations like WDIA, the first radio station programmed entirely for black audiences. He was absorbing not just melodies, but also speech patterns, vocal inflections, and storytelling techniques embedded within the songs and spoken word on the airwaves. One notable change often attributed to Memphis influence is a slight broadening of his vowel sounds, or a shift in intonation patterns. His Mississippi accent was already Southern, but Memphis provided a more diverse set of Southern accents, including those with stronger, more urban inflections. The use of certain slang words or particular ways of emphasizing syllables might have evolved during this period. For example, the energy and urgency often found in urban speech, particularly in youth culture, could have blended with his more laid-back rural drawl. He wasn't just hearing music, he was hearing conversations, arguments, jokes, and sermons. Each of these linguistic acts added another layer to his evolving speech. His voice became richer, more complex, absorbing the sonic landscape of a vibrant, diverse southern city. Did Elvis consciously try to sound cooler or more urban by incorporating Memphis speech patterns, or was it a purely subconscious process of assimilation? How much of his later perceived crossover appeal was actually rooted in the blending of these specific southern dialects he encountered in Memphis? And if he had never moved to Memphis, would his singing voice, and by extension his speaking voice, have remained confined to a more purely rural Mississippi sound, never achieving the same groundbreaking fusion? Number 15, did his music career reshape his natural accent? Once Elvis stepped into the professional music world, especially after signing with Sun Records in 1954, his language faced new pressures and influences. This wasn't just about singing, it was about public speaking, interviews, and interacting with people from all over the country. His music career didn't just put a microphone in front of him, it put his voice, both spoken and sung, under intense scrutiny. Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records, famously sought a white singer who had the Negro sound. This quest for a specific vocal quality meant Elvis was consciously working with sounds and styles that were part of his musical influences, but perhaps not entirely natural in his everyday speech. When he sang That's All Right, his voice showcased a fusion of country and blues. This fusion wasn't just in the instrumentation, it was profoundly in his vocal delivery. He used glottal stops, vocal fry, and specific inflections common in blues and rhythm and blues. These weren't necessarily typical of mainstream white Southern speech at the time. Consider the phenomenon of code switching, a sociolinguistic concept where individuals adjust their language style depending on context or audience. While Elvis likely didn't consciously switch between distinct languages, he certainly adjusted his vocal register, phrasing, and even vowel pronunciation when singing versus speaking. This isn't unusual for performers. Singers often adopt an onstage voice. But for Elvis, this onstage voice became incredibly influential and started to bleed into his public speaking. His early interviews are a goldmine for linguistic analysis. You hear a young man, often shy, speaking with a very pronounced, somewhat hesitant Southern drawl. But even then, there's an underlying confidence, a rhythm, that seems informed by his musicality as his career progressed. And he spent more time in recording studios, on film sets, and doing interviews. his speech began to adapt. The constant exposure to different producers, directors, and journalists, many of whom were not from the South, might have led to a slight leveling of some of his more regional pronunciation. This isn't to say he lost his accent, but rather that certain very strong regional markers might have been softened. The pressure to be understood by a national audience, especially through media like television, could also have played a role. Linguists like Walt Wolfram have documented how media exposure can sometimes influence regional dialect features. While Elvis never truly shed his Southern identity, the demands of celebrity might have subtly pushed him towards a more generally understood form of Southern American English, rather than a very localized Memphis or Tupelo variant. His singing voice in particular became a kind of universal language, but it was built on a very specific foundation of Southern phonology and prosody. The very act of singing with such emotional intensity, often blurring the lines between speaking and singing, undoubtedly honed his vocal capabilities in ways that affected his everyday speech. Did Elvis ever feel pressure to alter his accent for commercial appeal, or was any perceived change a purely organic byproduct of his fame? If he had continued to sing only blues or country, would his spoken language have developed differently, aligning more closely with one genre's linguistic norms? And how much of his vocal distinctiveness, the Elvis sound, was a deliberate linguistic performance rather than an unthinking expression of his origins? Number 14, was his accent consistent throughout his life? The short answer is no. Elvis Presley's accent was not perfectly consistent throughout his life. Like most people, his speech evolved. We can track shifts over the decades, influenced by his changing environments, his fame, and his experiences. The most noticeable changes typically occur between his early Sun Records years, his Hollywood period, and his later Las Vegas era. In the mid-1950s, his accent was very strong, a clear blend of rural Mississippi and urban Memphis. You hear the deep Southern drawl, the characteristic vowel sounds, and the specific rhythm of speech common to his region. The recordings of interviews from this period, like the famous 1956 TV Guide interview or various radio spots, clearly show this robust regional accent. He was still very much the working class boy from the South, and his speech reflected that without affectation. This was before extensive media training or the smoothing influence of Hollywood. As he moved into his film career in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, there's a subtle but perceptible shift. Hollywood often has a homogenizing effect on accents. Actors are sometimes encouraged or even coached to lessen strong regionalisms for broader audience appeal. While Elvis never lost his Southern accent, some of its sharper edges may have softened. He spent more time in California, interacting with people from diverse linguistic backgrounds. This exposure, coupled with the need to deliver lines clearly for film, could have led to minor adjustments in his phonology. Research on language acquisition in adults suggests that sustained exposure to different dialects can lead to subtle shifts, even without conscious effort. His film roles, though often playing Southern characters, sometimes required a more generic American sound than his natural speaking voice. By the late 1960s and 1970s, during his comeback and his Las Vegas residencies, his speaking voice had arguably become somewhat more refined. It still carried the unmistakable markers of a Southerner, but perhaps with less of the raw, unpolished quality of his youth. His interviews from this period, like the 1972 press conference for Elvis on Tour, show a man who is articulate, thoughtful, but still unmistakably Southern. However, there is a maturity to his delivery, a slight rounding of vowels that might indicate a move away from the most extreme Southern vowel shift features heard in his earliest days. He spent years communicating with diverse audiences, traveling, and living a highly public life. Such experiences naturally impact an individual's speech, often leading to what linguists call dialect leveling, where extreme regional features become less pronounced. It's important to note that these changes were gradual and subtle. Elvis never adopted a non-Southern accent. His core linguistic identity remained rooted in the South, but consistency is a spectrum, and his accent certainly wasn't static. It breathed and changed with him, reflecting the journey of a man who moved from a humble Mississippi home to global superstardom. It tells a story of adaptation, exposure, and the enduring power of his Southern roots. What if Elvis had undergone intensive dialect coaching for his films, similar to other Hollywood actors? Would his accent have been completely ironed out, and how would that have impacted his image? Did the increasing isolation of his later life, surrounded by a close-knit Southern entourage, actually cause a re-entrenchment of his older dialectal patterns? And were there specific individuals in his life who, through their own speech, exerted a significant, albeit unnoticed, influence on his linguistic evolution? Number 13. What words did he favor, and what did they tell us? Beyond the accent, Elvis Presley's choice of words, his lexicon, offers a fascinating glimpse into his personality and his cultural context. He wasn't known for a particularly expansive or academic vocabulary. Instead, his speech was often direct, earnest, and peppered with specific Southern and informal expressions that gave it character. Analyzing his interviews, spontaneous remarks, and spoken intros to songs reveals a pattern of favored words and phrases. One recurring theme is his use of terms associated with honesty, sincerity, and emotion. He often used words like truth, honest, sincere, and real. For instance, in a 1956 interview, when asked about his music, he might say something like, "It's just honest, you know? It's real." This reflects a value system often associated with the working-class South, where straightforwardness and authenticity were prized. His language wasn't flowery, it was grounded. He also frequently employed terms of endearment and casual address, particularly when speaking to fans or his band members. Honey, baby, darlin', and man were common. This created an immediate sense of intimacy and approachability, characteristic of Southern hospitality, even amidst superstardom. This interpersonal language reinforced his image as a man of the people, despite his fame. His slang was often rooted in the era and his Southern background. Terms like cat for a person, dig for understand or appreciate, and various expressions for being excited or impressed knocked me out. Blew my mind appeared in his vocabulary. These weren't unique to Elvis, but their consistent use placed him firmly within the youth culture of the 1950s and 60s, a culture he helped define. His casual grammar, such as ain't, or double negatives, though less common in his more formal interviews, also spoke to a less prescriptive, more naturalistic approach to language. Consider the work of lexical analysis, a linguistic subfield that studies word choices. If one were to perform a corpus analysis of all available Elvis transcripts, certain keywords would undoubtedly stand out as high frequency. Beyond the common everyday words, these would likely include terms related to music, sing, song, beat, performance, show, stage, and his relationship with his audience, fans, people, love. His frequent expressions of gratitude, such as "thank you very much," became a signature phrase, showing his ingrained Southern politeness. His language also reflected his deep spirituality. Words like "Lord God bless" and "gospel" appeared not just in his music, but in his personal conversations and reflections. This wasn't merely a performance. His deep connection to gospel music and faith was a core part of his identity, and it naturally colored his verbal expression. This specific lexicon, rich in Southern idioms, informal slang, and expressions of sincerity and faith, gave his speech an unmistakable Elvis quality. It was a verbal snapshot of his background, his values, and his journey. Did Elvis consciously curate his vocabulary to maintain a relatable persona, or was his word choice simply an unthinking reflection of his inner self? Or were there specific individuals in his life whose idiosyncratic phrases or slang he absorbed and then made his own? And how much did the sheer volume of his song lyrics, with their specific poetic constraints, influence the words he used in everyday conversation? Number 12, did his language reflect his social status? Elvis Presley's linguistic journey is a textbook example of how language intertwines with social status and mobility. He was born into poverty, a working-class Southerner. His early language, as discussed, reflected this background clearly. But as he ascended to global superstardom, his social status changed dramatically. How did this radical shift manifest in his language? In his early years, his speech was undeniably marked by features associated with lower socioeconomic status in the South. This included certain pronunciations, grammatical constructions, and lexical choices that were common among his peers. Linguists observe that dialectal features often correlate with social class, though these correlations are complex and culturally specific. For instance, more formal, less regionally marked speech has often been associated with higher education and social standing in many American contexts. Elvis's initial speech was far from that. It was raw, authentic, and rooted in his humble origins. As his fame grew, his language didn't undergo a radical transformation into a standard or upper-class English. He never lost his Southern accent. However, there were subtle shifts that can be interpreted through a sociolinguistic lens. One possible shift is a reduction in certain stigmatized features. For example, while he might have used ain't in very casual settings, he was generally quite articulate in public interviews. The pressure to communicate effectively with diverse audiences, from journalists to film executives, likely encouraged a slight move towards more widely accepted grammatical structures, even while retaining his Southern phonology. His vocabulary, while always authentic, also expanded to include terms related to the entertainment industry, business, and international travel. He spoke about contracts, tours, and global audiences. This lexical expansion was a natural consequence of his new status and experiences. He started speaking a language that allowed him to navigate his new world without abandoning the language of his old one. Consider the concept of prestige forms in sociolinguistics. While Elvis's Southern accent might have been considered a non-prestige form in some national media circles at the time, his immense popularity effectively inverted that. His accent, coupled with his charisma, became a mark of unique, authentic prestige. He didn't conform to linguistic norms, he redefined them. His voice, once a marker of his humble background, became an iconic sound that commanded attention and respect across all social strata. Biographers, like Elaine Dundee in Elvis and Gladys, often highlight his awareness of his origins and his desire to stay grounded. His language helped him do that. He could move between worlds, speaking to royalty or to his old friends with a fundamental linguistic consistency. This suggested that while his social status changed profoundly, his linguistic core remained firmly rooted. He demonstrated that Southern working-class speech could be powerful, charismatic, and globally appealing, challenging preconceived notions about what constituted acceptable or prestigious language. He proved that authenticity could trump perceived linguistic standards. Did Elvis ever consciously use his accent to project an image of approachability to his fans, even as his wealth grew? Were there specific moments or interactions where he might have intentionally amplified or softened his Southernisms depending on the social context? And how much of his continued use of Southern working-class speech was a deliberate rejection of the linguistic pressures often faced by those who achieve immense fame and fortune? Number 11. How much did the rural South imprint on his early language? The rural South, specifically Tupelo, Mississippi, left an indelible mark on Elvis Presley's early language. This wasn't just an accent, it was a complete linguistic immersion. His first years were spent in an environment where the rhythms of life were slower, and communication was often face-to-face, relying on established community norms. This fostered a deep connection to the specific dialectal features of his birth region. The speech patterns of rural Mississippi during the 1930s and 40s were characterized by several key features. One was a slower speaking tempo compared to urban centers. This gave his early speech a relaxed, unhurried quality, which sometimes contrasted with the energetic burst of his singing. Another significant marker was the monophthongization of the A vowel, meaning m might sound more like m. This flattening of diphthongs is a classic Southern trait. Think of how many rural Southerners pronounce fire as fa yeah. Elvis exhibited these traits in his early recordings and interviews. Research on language in the Deep South, such as that conducted by dialectologists like George Dorrell, often details the persistence of these older, more conservative Southern forms in rural areas. While cities are melting pots that accelerate linguistic change, rural communities often preserve older linguistic features. Elvis's early language, therefore, can be seen as a direct descendant of these historical Southern speech patterns. His parents, Vernon and Gladys, embodied these rural Southern linguistic traits, acting as his primary language models. Their influence on his pronunciation, intonation, and even choice of specific vocabulary cannot be overstated. Beyond phonetics, the pragmatic aspects of rural Southern communication also shaped him. There's an emphasis on storytelling, on conversational politeness, and on indirectness in certain social situations. While Elvis was direct in his performances, his early interviews show a deferential quality, often starting with sir or mom, a hallmark of Southern etiquette. This politeness isn't just a behavior, it's embedded in the language itself, in the choice of words and the structure of sentences. The influence of gospel music, too, was particularly strong in rural Southern communities. Even before Memphis, the churches in Tupelo provided Elvis with an early exposure to highly emotive rhythmic vocalizations. The sermonizing style, the call and response, the use of certain spiritual terms, these were all part of the linguistic fabric of his early life. While not direct language, these influences provided a sonic landscape that was deeply intertwined with spoken communication. His early voice, whether speaking or singing, was a clear echo of the specific linguistic environment of rural Mississippi, a testament to the powerful imprinting of his earliest years. If Elvis had remained in Tupelo for his entire life, how much more pronounced would his rural Mississippi accent have become, perhaps even diverging further from urban Southern speech? Did his family's particular idiolect within Tupelo have unique features that only he, among all others, carried forward? And how much of the melancholic, soulful quality often associated with his voice could be traced back to the spoken rhythms and hardships conveyed in the everyday language of his poverty-stricken rural upbringing? Number 10. What did his slang tell us about him in his era? Elvis Presley's use of slang provides a fascinating window into youth culture, the music scene, and his own identity during the 1950s and 60s. Slang is not just casual talk, it's a living, breathing part of language that signals group membership, defines generations, and reflects cultural shifts. Elvis, as a cultural icon, both adopted existing slang and, by using it, helped popularize it. In the mid-1950s, when Elvis exploded onto the scene, the slang he used was often a mix of African-American vernacular English Ave borrowings, jive talk from the jazz and blues scenes, and general youth jargon of the time. Terms like hep or hip though hip would become more common later to mean aware or cool, or cat to refer to a person were common. He might say, "That cat can really play," when talking about a musician. This usage positioned him squarely within the burgeoning rock and roll culture, which itself drew heavily from black musical traditions. His use of dig to mean understand or appreciate, "I really dig that sound," was another prevalent slang term from the era, showing his connection to the beatnik and jazz scenes that influenced early rock and roll. Words like groovy, though more prevalent in the 60s or far out, might have crept into his later vocabulary as well, reflecting the changing times. When he said something was the most, he meant it was the best, a common hyperbolic expression of the time. Consider the sociolinguistic function of slang. It often acts as a shibboleth, a linguistic marker that distinguishes insiders from outsiders. By using the slang of his peer group and the music industry, Elvis signaled his authenticity and connection to a particular cultural movement. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he delivered them with an easy, natural confidence that made them sound even cooler. Linguists studying historical slang often look at popular culture figures to track the spread and adoption of new terms. Elvis was a major vector for this. His slang wasn't overly academic or complex. It was expressive, concise, and often conveyed a sense of shared experience and understanding. It also helped him connect with his young audience who were themselves using and experimenting with similar language. This common linguistic ground created a bond, making him relatable despite his growing fame. Later in his career, while he maintained his southern core, his slang might have become less pronounced, as his public persona became more polished. However, in private conversations, he likely continued to use many of these informal terms, signaling comfort and familiarity within his close circle. His slang painted a picture of a rebel with a cause, a young man connected to the pulse of the changing American youth culture. Were there specific slang terms or phrases that Elvis coined himself, or was he primarily an adopter and popularizer of existing jargon? Did his slang use evolve differently in his private life compared to his public appearances? And if so, how? And how much of the danger or rebelliousness attributed to early Elvis was subtly conveyed not just by his actions, but also by the very informal and often black-influenced slang he employed? Number 9, was he a language innovator or simply an echo? This question gets to the heart of Elvis Presley's linguistic impact. Was he creating new ways of speaking, or was he just a charismatic conduit for existing linguistic trends? The truth is, he was a bit of both, but primarily a powerful echo and amplifier. And Elvis did not invent a new dialect or an entirely new set of words. His language was deeply rooted in the Southern American English of his time and place, enriched by African American vernacular English Ave influences. However, his unique blend of these existing elements, delivered with his distinct voice and persona, made his language feel fresh and revolutionary. He took sounds and phrases that were localized or confined to certain communities and pushed them onto a national and global stage. Think of it in terms of linguistic diffusion. Linguists like Everett Rogers, though focused on the diffusion of innovations generally, provide a framework for understanding how ideas, including linguistic features, spread. Elvis was a massive change agent. He didn't invent the Southern drawl or the use of specific blues inflections. But he took these features previously heard by a relatively smaller audience and made them universally recognized. When white teenagers across America started trying to imitate Elvis, they weren't just copying his dance moves, they were also, consciously or unconsciously, picking up on his vocalizations, his phrasing, and his linguistic mannerisms. His innovative aspect came from the fusion he presented. Before Elvis, the distinct sounds of white country music and black rhythm and blues were largely separate in mainstream media. His voice blurred these lines. He sang in a way that sounded black to many white listeners and white to many black listeners, yet it was distinctly Elvis. This linguistic hybridization was groundbreaking. He showed that these different linguistic and musical traditions could coexist and create something new. This wasn't about inventing new phonemes, but about blending existing ones in a novel and compelling way. For instance, the way he would slur certain words or stretch vowels in a song like Hound Dog or Jailhouse Rock came from the blues tradition. But hearing a white singer do it with such conviction was, at the time, innovative in its broader cultural impact. He made these sounds accessible and cool to a generation that might not have otherwise encountered them. His spoken voice, with its deep Southern intonation, became a symbol of a new kind of American identity, a rebellious, authentic, and rooted in the South, yet universally appealing. He wasn't inventing words like television or automobile, but he was reshaping the perception and reach of a specific linguistic identity. He wasn't a language creator in the academic sense, but a cultural force who gave existing language a new powerful voice and unprecedented reach. If Elvis had debuted in a different decade, perhaps the 1930s or the 1980s, would his linguistic fusion have been as revolutionary, or would it have been perceived as less groundbreaking? Were there specific linguistic features that, because of Elvis, gained a wider acceptance or were destigmatized in mainstream American speech? And how much of his perceived linguistic innovation was actually a projection by audiences onto a charismatic figure rather than an objective linguistic reality? Number 8. Did Hollywood change how he spoke? Hollywood has a long history of shaping and sometimes homogenizing the speech of its stars. For Elvis Presley, his film career, which largely spanned the 1960s, certainly influenced his public persona and, by extension, his language. It wasn't a complete overhaul, but a discernible smoothing. When Elvis first arrived in Hollywood, he carried a strong, unpolished Southern accent, and filmmakers and studio executives were keenly aware of how actors spoke, especially when aiming for national and international audiences. The goal was often clarity and a certain perceived neutrality for broader appeal, or at least a specific character voice. While Elvis often played characters with Southern backgrounds, even these roles sometimes required a slightly less pronounced regionalism than his everyday speech. Consider the role of dialogue coaches. Many actors, even those with standard accents, work with coaches to perfect their delivery. It's highly probable that Elvis, like other stars, received some form of guidance on articulation and projection for his film roles. This coaching might have encouraged him to soften certain vowel sounds, or to speak at a slightly faster, more even pace than his natural drawl. The influence of these coaches, even if subtle, would accumulate over his 31 films. A good example of this potential shift can be heard when comparing his early, raw interviews from the 1950s with his more polished dialogue in films like Jailhouse Rock 1957 or Blue Hawaii 1961. While the Southern essence is always there, the extreme drawl of his youth appears somewhat attenuated in his acting. He still sounded Southern, but perhaps a more generically movie Southern than his original Tupelo Memphis blend. This wasn't about losing his accent entirely, but refining it for a specific medium and a global audience. Furthermore, his time in California meant constant exposure to a diverse range of American accents. He was no longer solely immersed in the Southern linguistic environment of Memphis. He interacted with people from New York, Los Angeles, and other regions. This prolonged exposure can lead to subtle shifts in pronunciation, a phenomenon known as accommodation in sociolinguistics. You naturally adjust your speech patterns to some degree when interacting with people who speak differently. This is often unconscious. However, it's also important to note that Elvis never truly lost his Southern identity in his speech. His personal entourage, the Memphis Mafia, largely consisted of fellow Southerners, reinforcing his native dialect in his private life. So, while Hollywood likely exerted a pressure to slightly moderate his accent for professional purposes, his core linguistic identity remained firmly rooted. It was a compromise, a balancing act between his authentic self and the demands of a global entertainment machine. Hollywood didn't erase his voice, but it did put a filter on it. If Elvis had never made films and only focused on recording music, would his accent have remained closer to his original, more pronounced Southern form? That his movie roles, despite their often lighthearted nature, serve as a kind of linguistic training, making him more articulate in public life, and how much the perceived slickness or smoothness of his later speaking voice was an effect of Hollywood's linguistic molding, rather than a natural maturation of his speech. Number 7. How much did gospel music shape his words and vocal delivery? Gospel music was not just a genre Elvis Presley sang, it was the bedrock of his spiritual and linguistic upbringing. Its influence on his words, his vocal delivery, and even the emotional core of his speech is profound and often underestimated. From his earliest days in Tupelo to his final years, gospel was a constant. In Tupelo, Elvis attended Assembly of God churches, which featured a fervent, emotionally charged style of worship. This style often involved spontaneous vocalizations, call and response patterns, and a delivery that blurred the lines between speaking, shouting, and singing. This exposure provided him with an early education in vocal dynamics and emotive expression. The language of gospel music itself is rich with biblical imagery, spiritual metaphors, and powerful declarations of faith. And he absorbed this lexicon from a young age. Words like Lord, salvation, sin, grace, and spirit became deeply ingrained in his personal vocabulary. When he moved to Memphis, his connection to gospel only deepened. He famously spent hours listening to black gospel quartets like the Fairfield Four and the Golden Gate Quartet. He also admired white gospel groups, such as the Blackwood Brothers. These groups across racial lines shared a common vocal approach, powerful, harmonically rich, and deeply expressive. Their delivery often involved specific vocal techniques, like melisma, singing multiple notes on one syllable, glottal stops, and a certain rhythmic phrasing that infused words with immense emotional weight. Elvis incorporated these elements into his singing, but the underlying linguistic rhythm and emphasis also seeped into his spoken communication. Ethnomusicologists and linguists who study gospel music, such as Melanie Burnham and Portia Maltsby, describe how the genre uses language not just for conveying information, but for conveying feeling, for persuasion, and for communal experience. This communicative power undoubtedly influenced Elvis. His dramatic pauses, his sudden shifts in vocal intensity, even in spoken interviews, echo the dynamics of a gospel sermon or a powerful hymn. He learned how to use his voice to command attention, to convey sincerity, and to evoke strong emotional responses, lessons he picked up from the pulpit and the choir loft. His deep spiritual connection meant that the language of faith was genuine for him. When he spoke about his beliefs or about the songs that moved him, his sincerity was palpable. This was not a put-on. The words and phrases of gospel music were not merely lyrics, they were expressions of his deepest self. This linguistic and vocal heritage gave his performance a gravitas, a soulfulness that set him apart. It was the foundation upon which he built his rock and roll empire, imbuing his secular music with a sacred fire. Would Elvis have achieved the same emotional depth in his vocal delivery if his early exposure had been to a less fervent, more subdued religious tradition? Did his lifelong engagement with gospel music act as a linguistic anchor, preventing his accent from drifting too far from its southern roots despite global fame? And to what extent did the call and response patterns inherent in gospel singing subtly influence the way he structured his answers in interviews or his interaction with a live audience? Number 6. What about the African American influence on his language? The African American influence on Elvis Presley's language and vocal delivery is undeniable and profoundly significant. It's a core component of his sound, both spoken and sung. This wasn't a casual appropriation, it was a deep immersion and absorption from his formative years in Memphis. Elvis grew up in the segregated South, but segregation didn't mean isolation. Their cultural exchange, particularly through music, was constant. In Memphis, he lived near and interacted with black communities. He listened intently to rhythm and blues artists, blues singers, and gospel quartets on local radio stations like WDIA, which broadcast primarily to black audiences. He frequented Beale Street, a hub of black music and culture. This exposure was a direct conduit for African American vernacular English Ave to influence his linguistic development. Ave, also known as Black English Vernacular BEV by linguists like William Labov, has distinct phonological, grammatical, and lexical features. While Elvis never spoke Ave, he certainly incorporated elements of it into his own Southern accent. For example, some of the specific vocal inflections, the use of glottal stops, and certain rhythmic patterns in his singing are directly traceable to blues and gospel vocal traditions. These aren't just musical choices, they are linguistic choices that lend a particular texture and feeling to his delivery. Consider the concept of cultural borrowing or linguistic convergence. In mixed communities, linguistic features can cross ethnic lines. Elvis, as a white Southerner, absorbed these influences, integrating them into his existing dialect. For instance, the passionate guttural vocalizations found in some of his early recordings like That's All Right or Hound Dog show a clear debt to black blues singers like Arthur Big Boy Crudup and Willie Mae Big Mama Thornton, respectively. These were not just stylistic choices for the music, they were ways of using his voice, of articulating words that had deep roots in African American expressive culture. His spoken voice, while retaining its white Southern characteristics, also seemed to pick up on some of the expressive qualities. The raw, emotional intensity in some of his interviews. The way he might emphasize certain words or phrases could be seen as an echo of the powerful delivery found in black sermons or blues storytelling. Peter Guralnick's biographies meticulously detail Elvis's deep reverence for black musicians and their music. This reverence extended to the very sounds of their voices and the language they used to convey emotion and experience. This influence was crucial for his artistic success. It gave his music a depth and authenticity that transcended traditional racial boundaries in music. His voice became a bridge, carrying the sounds and linguistic inflections that had often been marginalized into the mainstream, forever changing the landscape of popular music in American English. He wasn't just singing black music, he was, in a very real sense, speaking and singing with a powerful black influence woven into the very fabric of his vocal identity. If Elvis had grown up in an entirely white, rural Southern community without exposure to Memphis's diverse cultural landscape, would his voice have lacked the spark that made him unique and revolutionary? How much of the controversy surrounding his early performances was implicitly tied to the perceived blackness of his vocal delivery and linguistic inflections rather than just his dance moves? And could a detailed phonetic analysis specifically isolate and quantify the percentage of Ave-derived vocal features in his overall sound compared to white Southern dialect features? Number 5. Did his military service shift his speech? Elvis Presley's 2 years in the U.S. Army from 1958 to 1960, stationed primarily in West Germany, offered a unique opportunity for linguistic exposure beyond the American South. Military service is often a significant period of linguistic change for individuals, as they interact daily with people from all across the United States, and in Elvis's case, with foreign nationals. When Elvis joined the Army, he was already a global superstar. His core Southern accent was firmly established. However, the military environment is a powerful force for dialect leveling. Soldiers from different regions of the country live train and work together. This constant interaction can lead to subtle accommodations in speech patterns. Linguists like Peter Trudgill have studied how social networks and contact influence dialect maintenance and change. In the Army, Elvis would have been part of a very diverse social network. He would have heard accents from the Northeast, the Midwest, and other parts of the South. While it's highly unlikely he would have adopted a New York accent, for instance, his exposure could have led to a slight reduction in some of his more extreme Southernisms. This isn't about losing his accent, but perhaps a slight smoothing out for greater intelligibility and to blend into a national military identity. The emphasis on clear communication in a military context also might have subtly influenced his articulation. During his time in Germany, he also interacted with German citizens and other Europeans. While he didn't become fluent in German, even basic cross-cultural communication can affect a speaker's prosody rhythm and intonation or carefulness of articulation. His girlfriend at the time, Priscilla Beaulieu, was an American living in Germany, and their conversations would have been in English, but the broader linguistic environment was international. However, several factors likely limited the extent of linguistic change. First, Elvis continued to surround himself with a close circle of Southern friends and family, many of whom joined him in Germany. This strong internal social network would have acted as a powerful force for dialect maintenance. Second, his primary occupation was still that of a performer, even in uniform, and his celebrity status meant he was somewhat insulated from typical soldier experiences. Third, 2 years, while significant, isn't always enough to fundamentally alter deeply ingrained speech patterns in an adult. Upon his return, his public speech and interviews showed that his Southern accent remained robust. Any changes were probably subtle, perhaps a slight tempering of certain vowel sounds or a bit more standard pronunciation in formal contexts, but the core identity was intact. His military service offered a brief pause from his professional life and exposed him to a new linguistic landscape, but it ultimately didn't fundamentally reshape the distinctive Southern voice that defined him. It simply added another layer to his complex linguistic journey, a temporary detour that reinforced, rather than erased, his roots. If Elvis had been a less famous soldier, forced to integrate more fully into diverse military social groups, would his accent have shown more significant changes? Did the formality of military communication subtly influence his approach to more structured public speaking in his later career? And were there any specific phrases or slang terms picked up during his military service that he incorporated into his personal lexicon, even if they didn't become part of his public persona? Number 4, how did his language affect his image? Elvis Presley's language, both spoken and sung, was a powerful tool in shaping his public image. It was an integral part of his appeal, controversial to some, utterly captivating to others. His Southern dialect, far from being a liability, became a core component of his mystique and authenticity. In the mid-1950s, when Elvis first emerged, mainstream American media often associated strong Southern accents, particularly those with working-class origins, with lack of education or sophistication. Yet, Elvis inverted this perception. His drawl, his directness, and his earnestness, delivered with undeniable charisma, instead projected a sense of raw authenticity and rebellion. He wasn't trying to sound like someone he wasn't. This genuine quality resonated deeply with young audiences who were tired of the polished, often bland language of mainstream entertainment. His language cemented his image as a real person, a working-class hero who had made it big, without forgetting where he came from. His distinctive vocal delivery in his singing, heavily influenced by blues and gospel, was also crucial. The way he slurred words, the emotional intensity he conveyed through specific vocalizations, and his rhythmic phrasing were radical for a white performer at the time. This linguistic and vocal style made him sound dangerous, exciting, and overtly sexual to some, and deeply soulful and authentic to others. It contributed to his image as a rule breaker, a boundary pusher. The controversy surrounding his black sound was not just about his music, it was about the very way he used his voice, which defied racial and genre categorization. His use of informal language and slang further enhanced his image as a youth icon. He spoke the language of his generation, signaling an in-group belonging that further endeared him to his young fans. Even his polite "thank you very much" became a signature phrase, part of his charming, slightly self-deprecating Southern gentleman image. He could be respectful and rebellious all at once, often through his language. Later in his career, as his image matured, his language also reflected a more seasoned yet still unmistakably Southern persona. The earnestness remained, but perhaps with a greater degree of articulation and confidence. His public speaking became more refined, yet never lost the warmth and directness that were hallmarks of his linguistic roots. His language was a constant reminder of his origins, a tether to the South that helped anchor his identity amidst the surreal heights of fame. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. That forged his enduring image as the king of rock and roll player, a title that very much implies a voice and a language all his own. Did Elvis ever express an awareness of how his Southern accent was perceived by national or international audiences? And did this perception influence his choices? How much of the danger associated with his early image was purely an auditory phenomenon, perceived through his voice and not just his lyrics or movements? And if Elvis had spoken with a neutral, non-regional American accent, would his career have unfolded differently, perhaps with less initial controversy, but also less unique appeal? Number 3, Was his speaking voice truly different from his singing voice? This question delves into the fascinating territory of phonetics and vocal performance. For Elvis Presley, while there were clear differences between his speaking and singing voices, they were fundamentally linked, drawing from the same wellspring of Southern American English. It wasn't a complete transformation, but an amplification and stylization. When Elvis spoke, especially in his early years, you heard a classic Southern drawl. This involved specific vowel shifts, like the Southern vowel shift and the monophthongization of AI. His speaking tempo was often relaxed, with a certain conversational rhythm. The pitch range of his speaking voice was generally in the baritone range, sometimes dropping to a rumbling bass in moments of emphasis. He used intonation patterns typical of his region, rising and falling in ways that marked his speech as distinctly Southern. His singing voice, however, was a masterclass in vocal manipulation and genre blending. While the Southern foundation was still very present, it was exaggerated and adapted. He could move effortlessly between a low baritone growl and a high tenor falsetto. This extended vocal range was far beyond his typical speaking range. In his singing, he employed specific techniques borrowed from blues and gospel glottal stops, vocal fry, melisma, sustaining a single syllable over multiple notes, and a powerful vibrato. These were not typically present in his casual speech, or at least not to the same pronounced degree. Consider the phonetic analysis by vocal coaches and music scholars. They highlight how singers often place their voices differently when singing compared to speaking. Elvis used his diaphragm extensively for power and breath control when singing. This focused effort for singing can alter resonance and projection, making the voice sound different. The emotional intensity in his singing also demanded a different kind of vocal production. When he sang, words were stretched, bent, and imbued with a heightened emotionality that transcended typical spoken communication. However, the connection remained strong. The very flavor of his singing voice lost. The way he pronounced consonants, the inherent rhythm, the underlying intonation, was deeply rooted in his Southern-speaking voice. The raw, bluesy quality in his singing wasn't an affectation applied to a neutral voice, it was an extension of the inherent characteristics of his Southern dialect. He didn't put on an entirely different voice to sing. He took his natural voice with all its regional nuances and pushed its boundaries, stylized its features, and amplified its emotional content for artistic expression. His speaking voice was the canvas, his singing voice was the vibrant, expressive painting created upon it. One flowed directly from the other, each informing and enriching the other. If Elvis had never sung, would his speaking voice have developed less vocal flexibility and emotional range? Did his constant practice of singing subtly influence his speaking voice over time, making it more resonant or dynamic? And could a detailed spectrographic analysis reveal specific phonetic commonalities that persist across his speaking and singing voices, despite their perceived differences, proving a deeper inherent connection? Number 2, what did his interview style reveal about him? Elvis Presley's interview style, especially in his younger years, offers a revealing window into his personality, his cultural background, and his evolving relationship with fame. It wasn't just about the words he chose, it was about his delivery, his hesitations, his honesty, and his inherent Southern politeness. In his early interviews from the mid-1950s, Elvis often appeared shy, even deferential. He would frequently use sir or ma'am when addressing interviewers, a hallmark of Southern upbringing and respect for elders. This was a direct contrast to his rebellious stage persona. This politeness revealed a grounded individual despite his burgeoning fame. His answers were often direct, sometimes brief, and lacked the polished, media-trained sound of later celebrities. He didn't speak in sound bites or carefully constructed messages. He simply spoke his mind, often with a slight stammer or a search for the right words, which only added to his authentic appeal. His language in these interviews was largely informal, filled with the Southernisms and slang of his youth. He spoke about his family, his faith, and his love for music with an earnestness that was palpable. This unvarnished sincerity helped solidify his image as one of us, a relatable figure despite his growing stardom. He wasn't pretentious, he didn't use big words to impress, he used the language of the people he came from. This lack of pretense resonated deeply with his fan base. As his career progressed and he became more accustomed to interviews, his style evolved. By the 1970s, he was more articulate, more confident, and less prone to shyness. His answers were more expansive, and he would often delve into deeper philosophical or spiritual topics. However, the core elements of his Southern politeness and directness remained. He maintained a conversational tone, avoiding overly formal language, even when discussing serious subjects. His "thank you very much" became a signature sign-off, a blend of gratitude and dismissal that encapsulated his Southern charm. Consider the pragmatic aspects of his interviews. He understood how to connect with an audience, even a remote one, through a microphone. His voice, with its characteristic drawl, was instantly recognizable. He used humor, often self-deprecating, and he wasn't afraid to show emotion. These were communicative strategies that went beyond mere linguistic structure. They were part of his overall persona, crafted not by PR firms, but by his own authentic interactions and experiences. His interviews were not just data points for linguistic analysis, they were performances of sincerity, revelations of a complex man trying to navigate an extraordinary life. They showed a natural communicator, unfiltered and real. Did Elvis ever express frustration with how his words or accent were interpreted by interviewers or the press? Were there specific recurring phrases or verbal tics in his interviews that betrayed an underlying anxiety or discomfort, despite his apparent charisma? And how much of the perceived authenticity in his interview style was a calculated performance to differentiate himself from other, more polished Hollywood stars? Number 1, what's the lasting echo of his language? The lasting echo of Elvis Presley's language is immeasurable. It's not just that his records sold millions. It's that his voice, his way of speaking, and his linguistic fusion left an indelible mark on American culture and popular music. He became a linguistic benchmark, a sonic symbol of a particular time and place that continues to resonate today. First, he brought a specific Southern working-class dialect to the global stage like no one before him. Before Elvis, such accents were often relegated to regional music or niche cultural expressions. He made it cool, sexy, and universally appealing. He demonstrated that Southern English could be powerful and charismatic, challenging preconceived notions about linguistic prestige. He made it okay, even desirable, for young people outside the South to adopt certain vocal inflections and linguistic mannerisms associated with his style. Linguists often study how cultural icons contribute to language change and diffusion, and Elvis is a prime example of this phenomenon. Second, his language broke down perceived racial barriers in music. By fusing white country and black rhythm and blues, and by drawing heavily on African-American vernacular English Ave vocal techniques, he created a sound that blurred lines. This wasn't just musical, it was deeply linguistic. He showed that linguistic features and vocalizations from marginalized communities could become the foundation for a new mainstream pop culture. His voice created a bridge, subtly altering the sonic landscape of popular English. The Elvis sound became a new standard, a reference point for vocal performance that transcended traditional genre definitions. Third, he left behind a rich archive of spoken language interviews, film dialogues, stage banter that provides invaluable data for sociolinguists and dialectologists. His speech captures a specific moment in the evolution of Southern American English, showcasing the blend of rural Mississippi and urban Memphis influences and the subtle shifts brought about by fame and exposure. His linguistic journey mirrors the broader social and cultural changes of 20th century America. Researchers can still analyze his phonetics, his lexicon, and his pragmatics to understand the nuances of Southern speech and the impact of cultural figures on language. Finally, the emotional power of his vocal delivery, both spoken and sung, continues to influence countless artists and speakers. He taught generations how to use their voice to convey authenticity, passion, and sincerity. His distinctive "hoo, huh, huh," or his "thank you very much" are more than catchphrases. They are linguistic artifacts that carry his unique vocal signature. Elvis's language isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a living legacy and an enduring echo that continues to shape how we hear, understand, and use the English language in popular culture. He didn't just sing songs, he sang a dialect, a culture, and a way of being into the global consciousness. If Elvis had been a more prolific writer or poet, using his unique linguistic sensibilities in written form, how might his influence on language have been even greater or different? In what ways might his vocal stylings have subtly influenced global accents of English through sheer exposure, beyond just direct imitation? And what specific phonetic or lexical features of his speech, still unquantified, could offer new insights into the enduring power of his unique linguistic charisma?